When we think of deadly disasters, we imagine earthquakes, fires, or floods. Maybe a tornado, volcano, or landslide. But what if I told you that on January the 15th, 1919, one of Boston's deadliest industrial disasters was caused by a byproduct of sugar? Picture this: a wall of molasses, 25 feet high, racing through the streets of Boston's North End at 35 miles per hour. In just minutes, this sweet substance would claim 21 lives, injure 150 others, and cause destruction equivalent to millions in today's dollars. This isn't the plot of some absurd movie. This is the terrifying true story of the Great Molasses Flood, where negligence met physics in the most catastrophic way possible. Later on, we'll reveal 5 key lessons learned from the disaster, the vital takeaways that will stop history from repeating itself. But how does something as slow as molasses become a weapon of mass destruction? The year 1919 found America celebrating the end of World War I, but in Boston's North End, industrial progress cast a dark shadow over the immigrant community. The Purity Distilling Company had constructed a massive steel tank in 1915, standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses. This wasn't just any storage facility, it was a critical link in the wartime economy, converting Caribbean molasses into industrial alcohol for munitions. The tank dominated Commercial Street like a metallic giant, its riveted walls looming over the tenements, firehouses, and businesses below. Workers at the nearby paving department, children playing in the streets, and families in their homes had grown accustomed to this industrial monument. The tank had been filled and emptied multiple times over 4 years, each cycle bringing millions of gallons of thick, dark molasses from the tropics to feed America's war machine. Yet beneath this routine operation, structural warnings were mounting, warnings that the company's management chose to ignore. What deadly combination of factors was quietly building toward disaster? From the very beginning, the tank was a disaster waiting to happen, but the signs were hidden in plain sight. Arthur Gell, the company's treasurer and man tasked with overseeing the building project, had rushed the construction to meet wartime demands and market realities. A company man to his core, Gell was acutely aware that missing deadlines meant missing millions. The original blueprints were never properly reviewed by a structural engineer, a cost-cutting measure that would prove fatal. Workers noticed the tank leaked from day one, with molasses seeping through rivets and pooling on the ground below. But instead of addressing these structural defects, company officials simply painted the tank brown to camouflage the leaks. Children in the neighborhood would collect the leaked molasses with pails, turning the industrial negligence into an impromptu treat. Maintenance man Isaac Gonzalez made repeated pleas about safety concerns, addressing Gell directly. "I'm afraid the tank is not safe, and if it should start to fall, I can sound a warning." "The tank still stands," an unmoved Gell told him. "The tank will stand." Most damning of all was the complete absence of safety testing. The tank was never filled with water to check for structural integrity before being put into service. What would it take for this ticking time bomb to finally explode? Boston was in the middle of a particularly hard winter, with freezing temperatures putting additional stress on the already compromised structure. The cold caused the steel plates to contract and expand repeatedly, creating microfractures in the metal that weakened the structure with each temperature cycle. But January 15th brought an unusual warm spell, with temperatures soaring from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees in just 24 hours, a dramatic 38-degree swing that created the perfect storm of physical forces. This wild temperature swing created thermal shock conditions that the tank's flawed design simply couldn't handle. Inside the tank, 2.3 million gallons of molasses began to expand and ferment, generating carbon dioxide gas that increased pressure on the already weakened walls. The molasses itself had arrived just days earlier from Puerto Rico aboard the steamship Miliero, and its higher temperature, compared to the Boston winter air, created additional thermal stress as the warm liquid tried to equalize with the frigid New England atmosphere. The large steel plates were beginning to buckle under forces they were never designed to withstand, their riveted joints screaming under pressure that was literally tearing them apart. A confluence of events would transform this industrial pressure cooker into Boston's sweetest nightmare. At 12:30 p.m., the ordinary rhythm of Commercial Street was about to be shattered forever. Locals in the vicinity of the tank heard what would later be described as a sound like machine gun fire, the rivets beginning to fail in rapid succession. The first witnesses saw the tank's steel plates bowing outward, straining against rivets that were popping like buttons on an overstuffed coat. Then, with a roar that could be heard for miles, the entire north side of the tank exploded outward, releasing its catastrophic contents in an instant. The initial wave of molasses stood 25 feet high, moving at speeds that defied every assumption about this thick, sluggish liquid. Physics explains this terrifying phenomenon. When molasses is under extreme pressure, it behaves like water, flowing with devastating speed and force. The wave picked up everything in its path: railroad cars, automobiles, buildings, horses, and human beings, carrying them along like toys in a tsunami. The Boston Fire Department's Engine 31 was completely buried under the sticky torrent, trapping firefighters inside their own station. An elevated train was knocked off of its tracks, buildings were lifted off their foundations, and the air was thick with the shouts and cries of human flotsam. But perhaps most horrifying of all was how the molasses began to slow and thicken as it spread, trapping victims in an increasingly viscous prison that made rescue nearly impossible. The grotesque amalgam of flood, landslide, and industrial spillage flabbergasted all who witnessed it. How do you save someone drowning in something that gets thicker by the minute? The immediate aftermath of the flood revealed a bizarre, cruel landscape. Rescue workers faced an almost impossible task, digging through molasses that were now cooling and hardening like concrete. The thick, sticky substance clung to everything, making movement nearly impossible for both rescuers and survivors. Victims who had been caught in the wave found themselves trapped in a substance that was simultaneously liquid enough to drown in and thick enough to prevent escape. Emergency responders had to use shovels, pickaxes, and even saws to cut through the hardened molasses, working around the clock in a race against time. The Boston Fire Department called in additional units from across the city, but their usual tools and techniques proved useless against this unique disaster. Harbor water was pumped in to try to thin the molasses, but this created a caramel-colored sludge that was almost as difficult to navigate. The smell was overwhelming, a sickly sweet aroma that mixed with the stench of death and destruction to create something that survivors would never forget. Some victims were found days later, preserved in molasses like insects in amber, their final moments frozen in this sweet tomb. Both man and animals were found together, locked in their final struggle. Workers had to scrape the substance from every surface: windows, doors, sidewalks, even trees, leaving the north end looking like it had been painted in brown lacquer. The total damage was staggering: 21 people dead, 150 injured, and property damage equivalent to over $100 million in today's currency. But the human cost couldn't be measured in dollars alone. Entire city blocks were leveled, and a community's trust in industrial safety was shattered forever. What would this disaster teach us about the true cost of corporate negligence? And who, if anybody, would be held accountable? In August 1920, Boston lawyer Dudley H. Dorr began proceedings in the largest civil suit in Massachusetts history against Purity Distilling's parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA for short. Nearly 1,000 witnesses would be called to testify: experts, eyewitnesses, survivors. Over 1,500 exhibits were admitted as evidence. Judge Hugh W. Ogden would hear 341 days of testimony. Dorr argued that the company was criminally negligent. They had placed a giant, structurally deficient tank in a densely populated civilian area and should be held accountable. USIA lawyers countered that the disaster was caused by Italian anarchists planting a bomb in the tank. The theory is not as unlikely as it may first seem. Boston had seen as many as 36 letter bombs sent to politicians, judges, and businessmen in 1919, claimed by followers of Italian immigrant anarchist Luigi Galliani, a fiery orator, intellectual, and unapologetic advocate of political violence. Charles Francis Choate, the brilliant combative lead lawyer for USIA, reminded the judge that anarchist posters were discovered on fences near the molasses tank. Just 5 weeks into the hearing, a bomb tore through Wall Street, killing 38 people and injuring over 100. Although never firmly established as fact, it was widely believed to have been planted by anarchists. How far of a stretch was it to imagine the bombers spotting the opportunity to pounce on a weak target and taking it? Dorr was not convinced. He called 5 sailors who were stationed on ships in Boston Harbor when the tank collapsed. All had seen active combat during the Great War, and were all too familiar with the sound of explosions. All said the sounds they heard were nothing like those of high explosives. Judge Ogden would hear hours of testimony on the terrible suffering of the victims, many of whom took hours or days to die from infection, pneumonia, or crush injuries. Witness after witness testified to molasses leaking from the tank in the months leading up to the collapse. When the time came to question the man responsible for the tank's design, Arthur Gell, Dorr did not hold back. He forced Gell to admit that he had not submitted the plans or specifications to any architect or engineer. When the metal to build the tank was delivered, did any builder or engineer inspect it? No, came the answer. Any expert in metals? No. Dorr cornered Gell on his failure to fill the tank with water to test for leaks, an explicit stipulation in the contract. It was considered an unnecessary expense, said Gell. By whom? Wondered Dorr. By me, Gell responded. There it was, the final admission that the definitive safety test for structural deficiency was declared unnecessary by a man with no engineering background whatsoever, an accountant who had been promoted beyond his competence, making technical decisions that required specialized knowledge he simply didn't possess. But if specialized knowledge was needed, it was provided by MIT professor C.M. Spofford. He stated on record that the tension on the steel plates should not have exceeded 16,000 pounds per square inch, or psi. On the day of the disaster, the molasses would have weighed 26 million pounds and subjected the tank walls to pressures of 31,000 psi, a figure nearly double that which should have been allowed, the professor concluded. He did not mince words. In my judgment, the tank was improperly designed, and its failure was due entirely to structural weakness. In addition, the testimony of Isaac Gonzalez was particularly compelling. His repeated warnings about the tank's safety and the repeated brush-offs he encountered grew more shocking with each hearing. It took almost 5 years before Judge Hugh W. Ogden determined that United States Industrial Alcohol was liable for the disaster. The company was ordered to pay damages of $680,000, the equivalent of almost $8 million today. Company executives had been more concerned about wartime profits than public safety, cutting corners on construction and maintenance to maximize their returns from government contracts. The brown paint used to disguise the leaks wasn't just cosmetic deception, it was evidence of a calculated cover-up that prioritized appearance over human lives. The process had led to the most damning of indictments. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 became a watershed moment in American industrial safety and corporate accountability, teaching us 5 crucial lessons that remain relevant today. First, engineering expertise cannot be substituted with good intentions or cost savings. The disaster proved that complex industrial projects require qualified professionals, not promoted accountants or rushed construction crews. Arthur Gell's lack of engineering background wasn't just a hiring mistake, it was a fundamental failure to understand that public safety requires technical expertise. The tragedy became a powerful example cited by those advocating for stricter licensing, oversight, and engineering safety standards. This discourse led to the establishment of mandatory engineering certifications and professional oversight for all major industrial construction projects, creating the regulatory framework that still protects communities today. Second, transparency in industrial operations is not optional, it's a moral imperative. The company's systematic cover-up of structural problems, from painting over leaks to ignoring employee warnings, demonstrated how corporate secrecy can turn minor problems into calamitous failures. The tragedy prompted new rules requiring professional certification for engineers and that they be required to sign building plans, along with their calculations. This ensured that they were held accountable for meeting safety standards. Third, regular safety inspections and maintenance are investments in human life, not optional expenses. The tank operated for years without a single comprehensive structural inspection, a negligence that seems almost unbelievable today. The disaster demonstrated that industrial equipment doesn't improve with age, it degrades, and that degradation can accelerate rapidly under stress. The victims' families sued not just for damages, but for systemic changes that would prevent future tragedies. Modern safety protocols requiring regular third-party inspections, stress testing, and preventive maintenance all stem from the recognition that prevention is always less expensive than disaster response. Fourth, community concerns about industrial hazards must be taken seriously, regardless of their source. Local residents had complained about the tank's groaning sounds and constant leaks, but their concerns were dismissed by company officials who saw them as uninformed outsiders. The disaster proved that people living near industrial facilities often have the best vantage point for spotting problems before they become catastrophic. The flood established the principle that people living near industrial facilities often notice problems before official inspectors do, and their observations deserve investigation rather than dismissal. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, corporate accountability requires more than financial penalties. It demands systemic change. While the Purity Distilling Company eventually paid millions in damages, the real victory came in the legal precedent that companies could be held criminally responsible for industrial accidents caused by negligence. The Molasses Flood investigation established that corporate executives couldn't hide behind limited liability when their decisions put public safety at risk. Today, as we face new industrial challenges from chemical plants to data centers to renewable energy infrastructure, the lessons from Commercial Street remain as relevant as ever. Every industrial accident that's prevented by modern safety regulations, every corporate executive held accountable for safety failures, every community that successfully fights back against industrial hazards, all of these victories trace their lineage back to that terrible day when molasses became a weapon of mass destruction. The next time you see industrial equipment in your community, remember the 21 victims of January 15, 1919, and ask yourself, are we still learning from their sacrifice? Or are we doomed to repeat their tragedy in new and unexpected ways?